At a crowded military base ceremony, a frail old veteran sat quietly in the back, ignored by everyone. No one saluted. No one asked his name, until a four-star general froze mid-speech, marched down in full uniform, and saluted him. What happened next left the entire base silent, and a nation remembering the hero they had forgotten. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? They didn't see him when he walked onto the base, just another frail old man in a weathered coat, leaning on a cane, his eyes tired but steady, his boots silent on the concrete that once echoed with marching men, and not a single salute met him. Not a single hand reached out to ask who he was or why he'd come, because in this new era of spotless uniforms and gleaming digital badges, there was no room for faded patches or medals worn soft from time. So they ushered him to the back of the crowd during the dedication ceremony, behind the officers' wives and the camera crews and the polished ranks of new graduates, who stood tall and proud, completely unaware that they were breathing the same air as a man who once bled in the mud of Heartbreak Ridge, who crawled through jungle rot in Ia Drang, and who pulled 3 men from a burning tank under a rocky sun, because he couldn't live with the sound of their screams. And while the base commander gave his speech about honor and legacy, the old man just sat on a cold bench in silence, fingers brushing the bronze star sewn onto his chest, a symbol so few had earned and even fewer remembered, until a 4-star general stepped from the reviewing platform and stopped mid-stride, his salute frozen halfway as his eyes locked onto that patch, because to him that patch wasn't fabric, it was memory, it was sacrifice. It was the face of a friend who died saving his life 40 years ago wearing that same insignia. And in that instant, the entire ceremony collapsed into silence as the general turned sharply, marched down the aisle of officers and dignitaries, and saluted, not out of formality, but out of reverence, a sharp, trembling gesture that shook every soldier present, because they had never seen a man of his rank bow his head to anyone, much less to an old stranger no one had noticed. And when the general spoke, his voice cracked the air like a rifle. I served alongside men who wore this symbol, few, very few, and we owe them everything. And as the crowd parted, whispers turned to gasps when someone finally read the faded name stitched onto the coat. Staff Sergeant Elias Rourke. Medal of Honor, Silver Star, Purple Heart, retired. And then someone remembered, someone Googled. Someone connected the name to the mission no one spoke of anymore. Operation Iron Veil. The classified hellscape where 6 men went in, and only 1 crawled out dragging the rest. And now he was here, not to be honored, not for a ceremony, but because he'd heard they were tearing down Hangar 9 to build a golf simulator, and Hangar 9 was where they'd patched him up, where he'd coded out for 64 seconds before a corpsman beat his chest and cursed him back to life, where he swore he'd never set foot again unless the boys he buried were forgotten, and they had been. Till now, until a general's salute cut through decades of silence. And suddenly the cameras weren't pointed at the speech, but at the man no one invited, and the news anchors stuttered through their lines as veterans across the country pulled out old crates, opened worn wallets, stared at the same bronze patch, and remembered, and the base paused its celebration, halted the band, and before the general could speak again, Staff Sergeant Rourke stood, spine straightening with something that looked like pain but felt like pride. And he said, I didn't come for speeches. I came for a name, and from his coat. He pulled a folded paper stained with age, unfolded it, and read aloud the names of 5 men, Taylor, Gomez, Black, Singh, and Boone, the men who didn't come back from Iron Veil. The men whose names weren't etched anywhere on that base, whose photos weren't framed, whose medals sat boxed in garages or pawned for rent. And as he read each name, his voice didn't shake. But the hands of the soldiers around him did. Because suddenly they weren't just witnesses. They were inheritors of silence, of duty, of memory. And the general nodded once and said, "Then today, this base becomes theirs," and ordered Hangar 9 preserved, not as a golf sim but as a living memorial. And when a young lieutenant asked who the man was, the general replied, "He's the reason you're wearing that uniform." And as the old man turned to leave, a ripple moved through the soldiers, boots clapped into position, and every single man and woman on that field stood and saluted. Some with tears they didn't bother to hide because respect, when overdue, arrives like thunder. And as Rourke passed the base gates, someone asked if he would stay for the banquet. And he smiled, shook his head and said, "I've had my fill of warm meals. Sanka, but tell your cooks to save a plate for Taylor. He liked peach cobbler." And then he vanished down the road in a rusted pickup with a license plate that read MOH 67, leaving behind a ceremony transformed, a base humbled and a legacy resurrected. And in the days that followed, stories poured in from every corner of the country. Medics who trained under Rourke in Vietnam, tank commanders who swore he once lifted a hatch with a broken arm, a retired Navy SEAL who said Elias carried him for 6 miles after his legs were gone, and even a former president who sent a private letter, sealed and hand-delivered, thanking him for a decision made in 1983 that prevented a political disaster. But Rourke never spoke to the press, never gave interviews, never accepted awards, because to him, the only recognition that mattered was the whispered names of the men he couldn't save, and the silence that followed. And when he died 3 months later in his sleep, there was no funeral with cameras, no 21-gun salute, just a folded flag left anonymously on the steps of Hangar 9, with a note that read, "You weren't forgotten. Not anymore." And in that moment, every man who had ever served, who had ever been overlooked, who had ever walked into a room and been ignored despite their scars, felt something shift, not just in that base but across a generation, because one man's quiet return had cracked the armor of indifference, had reminded a nation that heroes don't always wear ribbons or ride limos. Sometimes they limp in alone, wearing patches no one sees until someone salutes.